Thank you. Well, we're going to turn to 2 Kings 6. I'll give you a little chance to get there, and I'll give you an update. I'm excited to be in church today with my wife. You probably think, aren't you always with your wife? No, I have not been. For the last year and a half, I have flown to meetings. And I don't know if you remember, 2 years ago I was here and we parked our trailer back by the bus barn. That was our normal thing. Well, right after that, the slide outs on my trailer are not coming in all the way. It's a 2005 trailer, so we have worn it out. And we have, in our married life of 31 years, we have lived in an RV for 25 plus years. And we've only had 2 RVs in that whole time. So we typically wear them out and then get the next one. Well, we've had a hard time finding an adequate next one. So ours is, we can live in it, but the slide outs don't come in all the way. You don't want to be traveling down the road and then your slide outs come out and you kill somebody. That wouldn't be good. Or, we get stuck in Timbuktu somewhere and then that's where we now live because you can't get your slide outs to come in. So trailer's livable, but not travelable. Is that a word? I just made it up. So consequently, for a year and a half, I have flown to meetings, and almost entirely since the last time you saw me, 19 months so far. So that being said, we're parked over in Pensacola, and my mom and dad had lived in Pensacola for about 35 years, and both parents are with the Lord now. And so typically, although our home base is in Missouri, we would spend our winter months down here. Well, when my mom and dad passed, we didn't have that go-to place anymore. So we took money from their house, put it in a small house in Pensacola as our investment and kind of get off the road place. Well, it's a fixer-upper. And my dad was not limited in his abilities. He is a general contractor. I, however, did not get his abilities. This Band-Aid is one of the evidences of that this week. And so I've been doing some fixer-upper work with my brother-in-law, and my wife's sister came over and helped us this week. And so we've been driving back and forth, or we'll be driving back and forth from Pensacola. I'm actually able to sleep in my own bed for the first time in a while. And so that's a little overview of what's going on in our world. If you would pray for us, we're hoping to get a trailer ordered and get the family back on the road come February. I have a few meetings in January I'll fly to, but I really want to get the family back on the road with me. And then I've got a house to fix up, and that'll be our come off the road place when we're back in town. So, brief history. Glad to have my wife Angela. She's the one sitting by Kim, and we are honored that you'd have us back. Thank you very much. We're in 2 Kings this morning. January of 2018, we were down Central Florida, Tampa area. My son-in-law-to-be at that time was out of Providence Baptist in Riverview, Florida. And so my friend Dave Goforth was pastor there, and we had parked for a couple weeks off season at Providence Baptist. And this young man had taken interest in my daughter, would end up marrying her later. And so I remember one night we're at a Wednesday night service, and Brother Goforth was doing a study on the kings from 1st and 2nd Kings. And the way they would do their Wednesday night, they would do the Bible study time, and then they'd split up and they'd pray. And Brother Goforth gave a message out of 2 Kings chapter 6. It was tremendous. And I said later on, I have got to preach on that passage. It's where Elisha is being stalked by the king of Syria, and he wants to apprehend him because Elisha keeps telling the king of Israel, hey, he's going to attack you here. And so he dispatches his army, and he surrounds the city where Elisha is, and it looks like curtains. Looks like he's going to be wiped out, and his servant sees the army, and he runs back in and says, Master, what are we going to do? We're surrounded. And Elisha prays, Lord, please open my servant's eyes. And you may remember, he sees an army of chariots of fire, an army of angels surrounding the Syrian army, and God delivers them. It's an amazing account. And so when that was done, I said, man, I got to preach on that passage, which I'm going to do this morning. Well, then we split up for the prayer time, and we go into our little groups. The way they do it there is they'll break up into groups of 4 or 5, whatever, and they'll have the adults take some teenagers with them, and the teens will pray with the adults. So our future son-in-law joined me, and then my good pastor friend, Glenn Mormon, had been in Maryland for years and retired, and now was back in the church that he was out of originally. So Pastor Mormon's in his 70s, and we got together to pray, and he said, that was a good message, wasn't it, brother? I said, that was so good. I'm going to preach from that passage eventually. That just got me thinking. He said, you know the events we read about there tonight, he said they occurred in the city of Dothan in the Bible, not Dothan, Alabama, okay, Dothan in the Bible. He said they occurred in the city of Dothan. He said, hey, Rich, do you remember what else occurred in Dothan? I said, no, Brother Mormon, I don't remember. I'd be lying if I said I did. He said, it was in Dothan that Joseph's brother sold him into slavery. He said, isn't it interesting? One guy gets delivered out of Dothan by an escort of a band of angels, fiery chariots. The other gets sent by God from Dothan into slavery. But in both cases, God was working. He said, there's probably a message in that. I said, you bet there is. And that's how I developed the message I want to give you in this Sunday school hour. I call it 2 roads out of the city of 2 wells. 2 roads out of the city of 2 wells. I'll explain where the title came from. Many believe that the name Dothan comes from a Hebrew term meaning 2 wells. 2 wells. Now, most cities would have a well, a common well. Remember, Jesus met the woman at the well? People would go outside the city, and that's where they draw the water. So why would a city have 2 wells? Well, I'm going to get into that in a few minutes, but consequently, I've called it 2 roads out of the city of 2 wells. Let's start in the 2 Kings passage. We're going to go 2 places today, 2 Kings 6 and Genesis 37. But we'll start in the original passage where I heard Brother Goforth preach that night. Thought that is really powerful. Now, I will tell you, normally when I give a message, I'll make a clear outline for you. I often use points and subpoints, and I'll make all that clear. If you want to follow this week, I would encourage you to do it. I think it's easier to stay focused on a message when you follow along. But I'll tell you, in this message, this is kind of a narrative message. I'm just going to give you 2 key points, and you may just want to jot down some cross references or whatever from there. So don't look for a lot of structure in this other than the 2 key points. But I want to start with this. Number 1, if you want to jot down the notes, is Elisha escorted out from enemies by an army of angels. I'll repeat it for you. Elisha escorted out from enemies by an army of angels. And let's take a look at it. 2 Kings 6, beginning in verse 8. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel and took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, beware that thou not pass such a place, for thither, at that point, the Syrians are come down. And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him and warned him of, and saved himself there not once or twice. That's an idiomatic expression, not once or twice. That means it wasn't just an isolated event. It happened frequently. Every time the king of Syria is about to attack, the man of God tells the king of Israel, okay, don't go to that place. Don't go to that GPS coordinate. Don't go to that intersection, because that's where the attack's going to come. Verse 11, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing. He called his servants, said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. I'm going to stop there. I wondered, who told this servant that was the case? We don't know. We're not given any more detail. But somehow, this Syrian servant says to the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, he says, oh, yeah, it's none of us. There's not a spy in the group. There's not somebody leaking the information. No, whatever you tell in your private, like back in your bedroom, Elisha knows it. He even knows which prophet it is. He said Elisha knows it. He's tipping off the king of Israel. Verse 13, he said, go, spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. Behold, it was told him saying, behold, he is in Dothan. Okay, so there's the city where this is going to take place. Therefore, he sent thither horses and chariots, a great host, so a big army. They came by night and compassed the city about. Okay, so it's a strategic plan. They're going to besiege the city. You remember when you were in school and you used an instrument called a compass? And so there's a point at one end, a pencil at the other end, and when you twirl it, what shape does it make? A circle, yeah. So when it says he compassed the city, he circled about the city. He's got it surrounded, literally. Verse 15. And the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth. Behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. His servant said to him, alas, my master, how shall we do? He answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man. He saw. Behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. Okay, let me pause there, kind of catch up where we are. So the servant goes out in the morning, and he's prepping for the day. Probably his job is to make sure Elisha gets the food that he needs and such. So what would a servant be doing in the morning? I can imagine gathering bundles of wood. You got to start a fire to boil the water. Probably prepping breakfast, so maybe he's getting some eggs, whatever. But as he goes out that morning and he's looking around, all of a sudden I picture him dropping the bundle of wood or dropping a pitcher of water, and oh no! And he bolts back in the house. Master Elisha, we're in trouble. And isn't it interesting? Elisha already knows. He says, don't be afraid. There are more on our side than there are on their side. Now time out for a minute. Did Elisha see the chariots of fire around the city? We're not told. It doesn't specify. I have a feeling he did not. Well, how did he know they're more than with us than more than be with them? He'd walked with God long enough, he knew. He didn't have to see. You remember the scripture in the New Testament, we walk by faith, not by sight. That's 2 Corinthians 5:7. Obviously, that wasn't written at that time, okay? But he knew the principle. Boy, there's a reminder. Those who have a history of walking with God in regular times will not have trouble trusting God in the most difficult of times. You got to develop a habit of meditating on the ways of God, on the words of God. And Elisha did that. So, I don't know. I'm only inferring from the passage. I'm not given enough information to know more, but I have a sense that Elisha, it's not like he's got these night vision goggles where he can see angelic spirits. But then he prays, Lord, open my servant's eyes. So go back, where were we? 16, I think. And verse 16, he answered, fear not, they that be with us are more than they that be with them. Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man. He saw, behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. Okay, now at this point, start paying attention to Elisha prays, open his eyes, shut their eyes, open their eyes. There's a lot of opening and shutting of eyes about to go on. All right, verse 18. When they came down to him, now this is the Syrian army, they came down to him, Elisha prayed and said prayed to the Lord and said, smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. Elisha said to them, this is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me. I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. Okay, now stop here. Who were they looking for? Elisha. Who's talking to them? Elisha. Now he's playing with them. He said, this is not the right place. Oh, it was exactly the right place. This is not the man you're looking for. He's going to take him to the king of Israel. This is not the man, but I'll take you to him. Now think about it. All these guys have suddenly gone blind. All right, now, let me ask you, do you think any of the men in this infantry had been blind before? Look, there was no such thing as affirmative action back then, okay? One thing you could not do, if you were an infantryman, you could not be blind, okay? This is not being disparaging of people with a handicap. It's just if you're blind, you're not in the infantry. So all of a sudden, these guys go totally blind. Now, if you, a perfectly sighted person, were suddenly blind, what would you be doing? You'd probably be flailing around with your arms feeling like, hey, are you there? You're not going to believe what happened to me. And the guy next to him says, it happened to me too. And they find out the whole company of them are blind. Now, how do you get anywhere when you suddenly have a handicap that you were not born with? Well, Elijah says, follow me. How are they going to do that? Well, you can use your imagination. So everybody puts their hand on the arm, on the shoulder of the guy in front of them, right? Can you imagine a whole army lined up like this? And now they're going to go from Dothan to Samaria. That's 12 miles. Now, how long would it take you to walk 12 miles? I often take a prayer walk. In fact, as we were driving Clifford Street today, I just remember 2 years ago, I picked my certain routes, and each night I would walk a different route around here, and I like to walk and pray. And so I'd get out and walk, and we now have a dog, so I often take the dog with us on a walk. And I typically walk about 20-minute mile, 3 miles an hour. So I'm 6'6", but that's not real fast. You can walk 3 miles an hour is pretty good. But I'm perfectly sighted, and I'm not dealing with arthritis or anything else. So, 3 miles an hour when you're in decent health, that's one thing. But what's it going to take an army that just went completely blind, have never been blind before, and now we're going to go 12 miles? This didn't happen in just a blink of an eye, pun intended. Okay, so they're going 12 miles. They finally get there. This takes hours, I'm assuming, and they finally walk in, and the prophet prays, Lord, open their eyes. And now all of a sudden they get their sight back. And what happens at this point? I think we were in 19. Let's see. Elisha said, this is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me. I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. Came to pass, when they were come to Samaria, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. The Lord opened their eyes. They saw, behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. Okay, now you may remember when Israel divided as a nation, you had the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. Okay, the southern tribes stayed with the traditional capital of Israel, which was where? Jerusalem. The northern tribes established a new capital. That was where? Samaria. That's why they became later known as the Samaritans. Okay, so he leads them to Samaria. And so if you're a Syrian and you're now finding yourself in Samaria, you are in your enemy's capital city. And he prays, Lord, turn their vision back on, would you? And so the Lord does. Now all of a sudden everybody can see again. And they're looking right in the face of the king of Israel. Not a weapon has been lifted. Not a prisoner has been taken by force. It's just follow me, I'll take you where you... And man, now the king of Israel is licking his chops. Pick up in verse 21. King of Israel said to Elisha when he saw them, my father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? In other words, hey, do I kill them all now? What does Elisha say? He answered, thou shalt not smite them. Wouldst thou smite those whom thou hast taken captive with the sword, with thy sword and with thy bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink, and go to their master. He prepared a great provision for them, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away. They went to their master, so the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. What an incredible account. Again, I qualified it this way. Elisha, escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. Incredible. That's the story that I heard that night from our friend Brother Goforth when he was pastoring there at Providence Baptist in Riverview. We went to the prayer time. I was talking with Brother Mormon, my retired pastor friend. He said, that was a good message from our pastor, wasn't it? I said, it sure was. I'm thinking I'm going to preach on that. And that's when he said to me, Brother Rich, that incident occurred in Dothan. But there was another incident that occurred in Dothan. Do you remember what that was? I said, no, I don't, brother. He said, that's where Joseph's brother sold him into slavery. Let's jump over to that passage, Genesis 37. Genesis 37. I'm going to start here in verse 12. It goes from 12 down to the end of the chapter. So Genesis 37, pick up in verse 12. Here is the second point to the message that I want you to get. We started with Elisha, now we're going to Joseph, okay? Joseph betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. Joseph betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. Chapter 37, verse 12. His brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel, you remember that's Jacob, Israel said to Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, I'll send thee to them. He said to him, here am I. He said to him, go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, well with the flocks. Bring me word again. So he sent him off, sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Okay, so let's collect our thoughts as we go. So Jacob is the dad. He's got 12 sons. You remember Joseph was the 11th of 12. He was born to Rachel. Remember Jacob married Leah and Rachel. And so he's born to Rachel, and Jacob loves his wife Rachel. I'm sorry, Isaac and Rebekah. Rachel and Leah. Yeah. So he marries Rachel. He says, this boy is my favorite. Remember, he gave him the coat of many colors. Parents shouldn't have favorites, but not only did this dad have a favorite, he made it clear to everybody. He didn't hide it. And the rest of them despised Joseph for it. And you remember, he had the audacity to tell them some dreams that he had. Remember the dreams he had? One day, he said the sun, moon, and stars bowed down to his star. And another time, he had a dream that these stalks of corn bowed down to his corn. stalk. And it was obvious it was the whole family going to bow down to him one day. And the older brothers like, us bow down to you? I don't think so, stripling. You know, they did not like this kid. But Joseph wasn't being braggadocious. He was just telling them what God was revealing to him. You know, people are not always eager to hear what God has to say if it doesn't jive in their personal interest. And so he says, son, I want you to go check. Your brothers, the 10 brothers, the older brothers, had gone up to feed flock where they thought there'd be good pasture land. Oh, interesting. Notice they went from Hebron to Shechem. I wrote down in the margin of my Bible next to verse 14 there, that's 55 miles. 55 miles. Now, we drove over from Pensacola today. You know, it took us a little over an hour. It's no big deal today to go 50, 60 miles. You jump in your car and, you know, it's an hour and it's pretty simple. They didn't have cars to jump in. They didn't even have EVs, electric vehicles, to jump in and have to plug in along the way somewhere, right? They jumped in and he's going to go 55 miles. By the way, he didn't even have Hoka shoes or New Balance tennis shoes or Nikes to walk in. He got sandals with open toes, right? On dusty roads. How long would it take you to do 55 miles? And the only city of size he would pass through would be Jerusalem. Once he got out of there, he's gone 50 miles of nothing, nowhere. So he does it. Dad asks him to go, he goes. Okay, we pick up verse 15. A certain man found him. Behold, he is wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? He said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flock. Okay, so Joseph encounters a total stranger who's 55 miles from his house, and the man says, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for my brothers. Have you seen them? What's the chance? Well, read the next verse. The man said, oh, they're departed hence. I heard him say, let us go to where? Let's go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. Okay, you talk about providence. This random stranger sees Joseph looking around and he says, you're not from around here, are you? You ever stop in a town where they ask you that? You ain't from around here, are you? They can kind of tell, right? What are you looking for, son? My brothers. Got 10 of them. They're from Hebron. Haven't seen them, have you? Oh, yeah. He happened to overhear them say, yeah, we're going on to Dothan. Apparently, the pasture land they hoped to find in Shechem was not as good as they thought it might be, but they heard that, hey, yeah, there's some decent pasture land in Dothan, so they're going to try that. Okay, so from Hebron to Shechem is another 12 miles. So do the math with me. So Joseph had already gone 55 miles, and you add 12 to that, what are we up to there? That was kind of slow, class. I know, it's morning. I'm not a math guy. 67, okay? If we round up to the closest tens, what would we be at? About 70. Yeah, so think about this kid has gone 55 miles. His brothers aren't there. The guy's 17 years old at the time. It would have been so easy to go back home and say, you know, Dad, I went to Shechem like you said, but they were gone. I didn't find them. And he goes back, and Dad does not have GPS tracking on his cell phone. There is no cell phone. So, you know, Joseph could have said, I went up, I did what you said, I just didn't find him. But no, what you find with Joseph is constantly guided by integrity. The book of Proverbs says, the integrity of the upright shall guide them. The righteousness of the perfect shall direct his way. I think that's Proverbs, I think it's 13:3 and 13:5 that tell us that. The righteousness of the perfect will direct his way. So Joseph's brothers aren't there. He says, well, I guess I'm going another 12 miles. Now, it is really interesting. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the most routine of days can turn into a transformative experience in your life? Suddenly, what was just a typical, I'm just going to run to the store and get this, changes your life. So he goes on. Pick up verse 18. When they saw him afar off, okay, now think, Joseph's gone nearly 70 miles, and he hasn't seen anybody he knows, and suddenly he sees his brothers. Even though they didn't have the closest of relationships, he must have thought, all right, family. That's not their response. Verse 18, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. What's the word slay mean? Kill him. They're going to murder their brother. Verse 19, they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, let's slay him. Cast him into some pit. we'll see what will become, and we'll say some evil beast had devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Oh, so they're going to kill him, and then they're going to claim he got devoured by some wild animal. Verse 21. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hand and said, let us not kill him. Okay, now, Reuben is the oldest. Now, he was not a person of integrity. Remember, he was a fornicator. He had his own problems. But as the oldest brother, he feels some sense of responsibility. So he says, no, we're not going to kill him. Verse 22. And Reuben said to him, shed no blood. Cast him into this pit that's in the wilderness. Lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. It came to pass, when Joseph was come to his brethren, they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. Now, at this point, I want you to pay attention how the coat of Joseph becomes a centerpiece of attention. There's this coat, and there'll be another one in a few minutes we'll see. And the garment of Joseph really becomes an interesting focal point. So they rip off his coat of many colors. Verse 24. They took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Now, why are we told that? This pit was apparently a cistern, or what's another word for a cistern? A well. And there was no water in it. Now, really interesting, at this point, I must confess, I am just making some inferences. I cannot say this conclusively. But you know, Dothan was allegedly called the city of two wells. That's where the name Dothan is derived. And I wonder, why two wells? Would it be a safe inference that this one had dried up, so possibly they had to dig another one? I think that's a safe inference. And isn't it interesting that a well typically is meant to be life-sustaining, but in this case, the dried-up well becomes life-confining. That which should have given life now literally enslaves him. He's tossed into the pit, and he can't get out. He's like a caged animal. So they threw him into the pit. There was no water in it. Verse 25. They sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. Judah said to his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. There passed by Midianites, merchantmen. They drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit. They sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. They brought Joseph into Egypt. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. Now, apparently, Reuben wasn't around when the sale was made. I don't know for sure, but you might get the idea that Reuben perhaps wandered off thinking, okay, what am I going to do here? They're trying to kill him. I got to find some way to rescue our brother out of this. Whatever reason, Reuben's not around when the sale is made, and he comes back to the pit, and Joseph's not in the pit, and he thought, oh man, they killed him. I wasn't here. So he tears his clothes. He's in grief. Verse 30. He returned to his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? In other words, Dad's going to hold me responsible. I'm the oldest. Verse 31, they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father. Now notice, they sent the coat and they brought it to their father. Who's they? Yeah, either one of the brothers or maybe one of the servants that's with him. So apparently they dipped the coat of many colors in goat blood, and they send it ahead of them to their dad. And what's dad left to conclude? Hey, just read on, middle of verse 32. They said, this have we found, know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it. He said, it is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Oh, Joseph, it was without doubt rent in pieces. Jacob rent his clothes. He put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons, his daughters, rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. He said, I'll go down to the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. So they leave their father to conclude that Joseph got devoured by an evil beast. Who sent Joseph on this assignment? Dad did. So who is from this point going to live with grief? Dad. Did Dad do anything wrong here? No, isn't it incredible how people who become consumed with self really do not care what they may cause others to suffer? They just say, hey, because all they're concerned about is covering their own tracks. They send the bloody coat to Dad and say, hey, we came upon this on our journey. Is this what we think it is? I mean, who else had a coat like that? And they let Dad make his own conclusions. You might say, well, they didn't lie. Well, their actions were lying. Those were lying actions. They left their dad knowingly come to false conclusions and then incorrect the record. You talk about the height of selfishness. These brothers not only in their heart were ready to kill their brother. You remember Jesus said, John the apostle wrote, whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer. You know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him. Jesus said, whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, that is empty one, shall be in danger of hellfire. Shall be in danger of the judgment. Whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. In other words, Jesus said, out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, murders. You don't actually have to pull a trigger and fire a bullet into somebody's chest to be guilty of murder. It starts in the heart. And these brothers would have willingly killed Joseph to be rid of him, but now they concoct this plan where, hey, we make money off of it. He's sold off into slavery. They don't care what happens to him. They don't care what happens to their dad. Just as long as we don't have to pay the price. Well, let me tell you, the whole family is going to pay a price for this. Hey, just a reminder, your sin doesn't just affect you, it affects everybody else too. So, let me summarize what happened. Again, I've entitled this second observation, Joseph betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. I think you know what happens. He gets taken off to Egypt, gets auctioned off as a slave. But apparently they know this guy is not your typical slave. And apparently he's a high dollar because he gets auctioned off to a man called Potiphar, who was an officer holder in the land of Egypt. And Potiphar is in charge of the guard, the prison. He's an officer of the guard. The prison comes in later. He's officer of the guard, and apparently he's got a position of status. Well, Joseph proves trustworthy, so much so that Potiphar says, hey, look, you take care of all the affairs of my household. Remember now, this kid got auctioned off into slavery when he was 17 years old. Now again, that was a man. There was no adolescence in that day. You went from 13 to manhood, okay? He's a man, but he's a young man. And he had been living under his dad's roof at this time, but boy, what an ethic he had learned, work ethic. He's so trustworthy. Potiphar says, I don't even need to know what the books are. You just manage my affairs. Can you imagine having a slave in your household and you just trust him to deal with all the finances, all the goings on of the family? So much so that he's not even worried that his wife's around this guy all the time. And then you remember the day comes that Potiphar's wife has some evil intentions. And when you read this, do not get the idea that, Potiphar is probably significantly older than Joseph, and she's probably a much older woman and not attractive to him. I don't think that would have been the case, because remember, the Egyptians were all into status and all into everything fleshly. She'd be like the trophy wife, that's what I imagine, and she's thinking, Potiphar's kind of a little older than me, and this guy, he's a specimen. This guy, handsome fella. And she repeatedly tries to entice him into an adulterous relationship. And what does he say? No way. In fact, what does he say? How can I do this evil and sin against whom? Against God. Okay, pause here for a minute. Think in context. They do not have a single book of the Bible. He's living the book of Genesis. They don't have a single written scripture. He does not have a clergyman to keep him on track. His own family have betrayed him. He has been sold as property into Egypt. If ever there would be reason for a person to be bitter or disillusioned, it would be Joseph. But what's amazing, you do not find disillusionment or bitterness in Joseph. You don't find resentment toward God. I mean, put yourself in his place. What would your emotions be telling you? If the God of Israel is really true, or the God of heaven is really true, why do I get treated like this? How could he let this happen? How can my brothers do this? Where's God in all this? Isn't it incredible? You and I have a completed word from God, the Bible. We've got a local church that teaches us the things of God. we've got benefits like Christian radio broadcast and Christian materials, and we have fellowship with each other. Joseph has none of those benefits. And yet Joseph remains more steadfast in his devotion to God than a lot of Christians I know who have all of the benefits that I just listed. Incredible. So Potiphar's wife comes in one day and she forcibly grabs him. Remember, she laid hold of his coat. I mentioned, pay attention to the coat. She says, come lie with me. I mean, she's not even subtle about her intentions. Potiphar's not around. Let's have our fling. And he says, how can I do this evil? And he worms out of her hands and he escapes. Well, she's got the coat in her hands. And you remember what happens then? She walks into the other servant and says, see this? Your master, her husband, brought in the Hebrew slave to mock us. Now she did the wrong and she's blaming the other. That's called projectionism, by the way. It goes on all the time in our society. You blame the other party for doing what you yourself have done. And so she says, look what happened here. She's the liar. She's the adulteress. And she's blaming him. She frames him, and what happens? Potiphar has him thrown in prison. And for sake of time, I'm going to go on the fact that most of you probably know the details of the story. He ends up in prison. Now, interesting. I'm going to infer, and I know I'm doing a fair bit of inferring in my message here. That's why I tell you, when I know what I conclude biblically, and I know some things I'm just making an inference, I'm going to infer that Potiphar probably knew his wife wasn't being completely truthful. Because if she were being completely truthful, he'd have had him put to death. But he didn't have him put to death. Why? I think he knew Joseph was more trustworthy than his own wife, but he's got to save face. So he's got him put in prison. But he's taken to prison, and then it's the captain of the guard. Remember, Potiphar's over the guard. So he and this prison keeper talk, and he says, look, here's what's going on. I got to put him in prison, but treat him with dignity. And you remember the next thing that happens? He's elevated to the right-hand man of the prison keeper. And you know how the story goes. He's in there, and he's just being faithful. This is incredible. Wherever he goes, he's faithful his whole life. No matter what circumstances he's in, he's just proven faithful. That's a good lesson for you and me. Wherever you've been, do you prove faithful? Or you know, the Bible warns us against eye service as men pleasers. That means you're only serving when somebody's eyes are on you, Book of Ephesians talks about. So, you know, you've seen all the kids on the cell phone until the boss walks in and all of a sudden they're cleaning counters and they get busy, right? It's a great reminder for all of us guys as you're developing your own work ethic. You do what you do as to the Lord, not to men. Joseph's a good example of that. So the prison keeper is elevating Joseph, and one day a couple of real high officials end up in prison, the butler and the baker. You remember the account? Now, it's the butler or the baker. I don't know what happened to the candlestick maker, but the butler and the baker got put in prison. And you remember they have these dreams, and they're really troubled. What do the dreams mean? And Joseph says, oh, listen, there's a God in heaven. He can interpret your dreams. Tell me your dreams. And so the butler tells his dream, and Joseph says, oh, well, that means in 3 days you're going to be restored to Pharaoh's palace. The baker says, oh, well, listen, I had this dream, and I'm carrying this basket on my head, and it's got bread, and these birds come along, and they eat the bread out of the basket, and what does that mean? And Joseph said, not as good as the other guy. In 3 days, you're going to be put to death. And that's exactly what happens. So the guilty one dies, the innocent one gets put back to Pharaoh's palace, and on the way out, Joseph says to him, hey, would you please tell Pharaoh what's happened to me? I was unjustly accused, and oh yeah, I'll tell him. And then he forgets. And eventually, Pharaoh has dreams. 2 years go by. You know, I may repeat this in the morning message, but my pastor used to say, and I see this so often in my own life, God is never in a hurry, but he's always on time. Have you ever noticed how slowly God seems to operate sometimes? God's never in a hurry, but he's always on time. One day, Pharaoh has a dream. Actually, he has two dreams. 7 fat cows swallowed up by 7 skinny cows, 7 fat corns of stalk swallowed up by 7 skinny stalks of corn. Sorry, stalks of corn. Yeah, and what does it mean? And the butler says, I remember now my error. There's a young man in the prison. He has the ability to interpret dreams. Well, go get him. And not only does Joseph interpret the dreams, Pharaoh said, who could be wiser than this guy? And he makes him governor over all Egypt. And you remember the story. Eventually, the famine that comes after 7 years of plenty, then we're into the famine, and it's so severe, they've had to lay up in anticipation. Well, Joseph's family didn't know that was coming. So in Hebron, they're having famine, and they said, we've heard there's corn in Egypt. Go to Egypt and get the corn. All right, let's go to chapter 45. We'll wrap it up. So you know how the brothers come before Joseph, and he knows who's bowing before him, the fulfillment of his very dreams. They bow down before, and they have no idea. You think, how can they not recognize their own brother? Well, it's really simple. They sold him into slavery, and they have not seen him now in 13 years. He's 30 when all this happens, 17 when they sold him. And not only that, the Egyptians, they had those kind of funny hairdos. They'd shave their head on the side, and they had this sprig of hair sticking out the other side. You don't suppose Joseph looked like that? I suppose he did. He's property. He does what they tell him. This is their regulation haircut, right? I love the guys who say, I'm joining the service. I'm so tired of my parents' rules. Some of you know about that, right? So Joseph's got his regulation haircut. He's got his Egyptian dialect, and they have no idea. And they bow down in his presence, and Joseph can hardly contain himself. And you remember the story? He says, how do I know you haven't come to spy out the land? How do I know you're not antagonists? Well, no. We're literally a band of brothers, 12 brothers. Well, one of our brothers is dead. Yeah, the one they're talking to. They think he's dead. One of our brothers is dead. Our youngest brother is at home. He said, all right, go bring me the youngest brother. That's his brother Benjamin. That's how I'll know you're telling the truth. And you remember how all this plays out. He toys with him, etc. Chapter 45, pick up in verse 3. Joseph said to his brother, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? His brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Yeah, that's kind of the understatement of the chapter. Joseph went to his brethren and said, come near to me, I pray you. This is the first time he speaks to them in Hebrew. And they came near to him. He said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. He's not avoiding the elephant in the room. Now, therefore, be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath famine been in the land. There are yet 5 years in the which there will neither be earing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you, but God, not you that sent me hither, but God. And you remember the whole family moves into Egypt, and that's why Israel ends up being in Egypt for the next 430 years. And God literally brings his people out of Egypt. I want to close by reading you another true account. Remember, these are not Bible stories. What we just read is actual history. And talking about 2 roads out of the city of 2 wells. Okay, we had Elisha escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. That was in Dothan. Then we have Joseph sold from Dothan into Egypt. Joseph betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. In both cases, God was providentially working for the good of his man and for the good of his people. A pastor friend of mine gave me this book. Pastor Greg Allison is a retired pastor from Bible Baptist Church in Durham, North Carolina, or Creedmoor, North Carolina. He gave me this book called Legacies of Light, and it's short biographical sketches of some famous Christians. And I was looking through, I love biographies, and there are people in here like A.W. Tozer, Oswald Chambers, Adoniram Judson, Fanny Crosby, Jim Elliot, Hudson Taylor, Charles Spurgeon. People I know, right? But the first account is a couple called David and Svea Flood. Svea, S-V-E-A. I'd never heard of them, and I wondered, why does he open this book with 2 people I'd never heard of? And then I read the story, and I'm going to close by reading it to you. It's incredible. In 1921, David Flood and his young wife Svea, along with their little 2-year-old son, left Sweden for the interior of Africa. They traveled with another missionary couple, the Ericksons. These 2 couples were active church members. They sang in the choir. Svea played the violin, was the church soloist. But they'd committed their lives to taking the gospel to unreached tribes in Africa. They were filled with enthusiasm and optimism as they literally hacked their way through the mountains of the Congo, eager to begin their ministry at some yet undetermined, unreached village. To their surprise, however, one village after another refused them entrance, convinced that they would anger the local village gods and bring great trouble on the people. After days of carrying their own supplies, they were hungry and weak. They prayed as they reached yet another village on the side of a mountain that they would finally find rest and ministry opportunities. But the chief in the village was even more hostile than all the others. He demanded they leave. They carried their supplies farther up the mountain. They put up their tents. They were too weary to set out again, so they decided to clear the brush, build mud huts, and do their best to reach these hostile villagers. During the next agonizing weeks, which stretched into months, David and Svea Flood struggled with learning Swahili, and along with the Ericksons, tried everything they could to reach the villagers below. The village chief only tightened his grip on the people. The people were prohibited from even visiting the missionaries, except for one little boy. He was allowed to go up and sell them chickens and eggs. David was amazed at his wife's insistence that while they might never reach the village, and probably never impact Africa, she could perhaps win this one child for Jesus Christ. Every time this boy visited their camp, she showered him with love and attention. And sure enough, one afternoon, the other missionaries watched as Svea knelt with this little boy and led him in a prayer of repentance. That boy put his trust in Jesus Christ. He had to keep his decision for Christ a secret in the village, lest he be forced to leave or something worse. Eventually, the Ericksons decided to leave David, Svea, and their little boy and return to an established mission station, which was many miles away. Even though the Flood family battled malaria and desperately crude conditions, they decided to stay put. Sometime later, Svea announced she was expecting their second child. She was already weak, struggling physically, and David feared the worst. It was too late to travel through the jungles of the Belgian Congo without risking her life and the life of their unborn child. The baby would be born in their mud hut on that mountain. The newly converted boy carried the news back to the village, and the chief surprisingly allowed one of the women to serve as a midwife. By the time the baby was due, Svea was weak with malaria. When the African midwife arrived, Svea was groaning in pain and suffering from a high fever. When the little girl was born, Svea whispered that she was to be called Aina, A-I-N-A, Aina, a classic name for Swedish girls. 17 days later, Svea Flood died. Hopeless, filled with bitter rage, David dug a crude grave for his 27-year-old bride. How could he possibly care for a young son plus a sickly baby girl without assistance? He hired a young man from the village along with several others, and he took his children down the mountain to the mission station. He was finished with the ministry, the gospel, and God. As far as he was concerned, God had taken the life of his faithful bride, and their ministry had been nothing less than a tragic waste. Returning to Sweden was a monumental task for David. He knew he had no one to care for his baby girl. The Ericksons had been unable to have their own children, so David offered them the opportunity to adopt Aina. They were thrilled at the chance and agreed to do so. With that, David took his son and left the station, never to return again. He never even looked back. Before Aina turned 1 year old, Joel and Bertha Erickson's food was poisoned by unbelieving natives. They died within hours of each other. Aina was once again without parents, but she was soon claimed by another missionary couple and raised as their own daughter. When she was 3 years old, Aina and her adoptive parents left the mission field for good. They eventually settled in South Dakota. Her Swedish name was changed to Aggie. Aggie would later write that she was a young girl. Even as a young girl, she knew she was different. She'd become known as the daughter of the missionary who died on the mountain, rescued by missionaries who were then poisoned, and would become a girl without a country. Eventually, Aggie attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis and married a godly young man who entered the ministry. Years went by. Aggie had no information about her father. She knew very little of her past. She knew her parents' names, of course, and that their homeland was Sweden, but that was about it. She hardly had time to think about it. With a husband and a family and a busy ministry, her husband, Dewey Hurst, had become president of a Bible college in Seattle, Washington. Then one day, unexpectedly, a Swedish religious magazine appeared in her mailbox. She had no idea who sent it, and she couldn't read the words, but as she turned the pages, one photograph struck her attention. It was a picture of a small white cross planted in the earth over an obvious burial site, and on the name of that cross was Svea Flood. She immediately took the magazine to a college professor she knew who could translate the article. The professor translated as she read, telling how two missionaries pushing through the African jungle, camping at night, traveling by day, came across a village in the Belgian Congo and found this burial plot that they had photographed. They began to inquire and found out this was the grave of a missionary who had died shortly before giving birth to a baby girl, but not before leading one African boy to Christ. The woman's widowed husband had left their daughter in the hands of fellow missionaries. The article went on to say, sadly, Svea Flood didn't live long enough to learn that that little African boy that she had won to Christ on that mountaintop in time went on to gain permission from the village chief to start and build a school. Gradually, this now mature young man, teacher, and leader taught the gospel of Christ, and all his students came to trust Jesus Christ as well. They then evangelized their parents, and even the chief became a Christian. Now the village had 600 believers and an active church professing faith in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. All this came from the sacrifice and tears and the sowing of David and primarily Svea Flood. Aggie couldn't believe the news. She began to cry and thank God for letting her learn the truth of her parents and the sacrifice of and the harvest of fruit. For their 25th wedding anniversary, the Bible college gave the Hurst a vacation to Sweden where, among other things, Aggie could search for her father. It wasn't difficult to find the family. David Flood had remarried and had 4 more children before his second wife also died. Now an old man, he was wasting away as an alcoholic and a professed agnostic. Who dared anyone to talk to him about God? After a joyous meeting with her half-brothers and half-sister, Aggie brought up the subject of seeing their father. Her siblings weren't too optimistic about that idea. Their father had become deeply bitter. He had little to do with any of them, and most of all, he hated God. They warned whenever he heard the name of God, he flew into a rage. Aggie was determined to see him. She eventually made it to his little apartment where the door was answered by a housekeeper. Inside the room, there were liquor bottles on every windowsill. The table was covered with more bottles. And in the far corner was a small, wrinkled old man lying on a rumpled bed, his head turned away. Diabetes and a stroke had confined him to this one room for the past 3 years. "Papa," she said tentatively. He turned and began to cry. "Aina, I never meant to give you away." "It's all right, Papa," she replied, taking him gently in her arms. "God took good care of me." The man instantly stiffened. The tears stopped. "God forgot all of us," he said. "Our lives have been like this because of him." He turned his face back to the wall. Aina stroked his face and then continued, undaunted, "Papa, I've got a little story to tell you, and it's a true one. You didn't go to Africa in vain. Mama didn't die in vain. The little boy you won to the Lord grew up to win that whole village to Jesus Christ. The one seed you planted just kept growing and growing. Today, there are more than 600 African people serving the Lord because you were faithful to the call of God in your life. Papa, Jesus loves you. He never hated you." The old man turned back to look into his daughter's eyes. His body relaxed. He began to talk. By the end of the afternoon, he'd come back to the God that he had so resented for many decades. Over the next few days, father and daughter enjoyed many warm moments together. Aggie and her husband soon had to return to America, and within a few weeks, David Flood had gone into eternity. Let me give you a final addendum to this story. A few years later, Aggie and her husband attended an evangelism conference in London. A report was given from the nation of Zaire, formerly the Belgian Congo, by the superintendent of the National Church Association. He represented over 100,000 baptized believers. He spoke of the amazing spread of the gospel in his nation. Afterward, Aggie rushed forward to meet him, asking if he'd ever heard of her parents, David and Svea Flood. "Yes, madam," the man said, in French, his words being translated into English. "It was Svea Flood who led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents before you were born. In fact, to this day, your mother's grave and her memory are honored by all of us." He embraced her in a long, sobbing hug. He continued, "You must come to Africa. You must see, your mother is the most famous person in our history." She agreed, and after months of planning, Aggie and her husband made the long journey back to the place of her birth. They eventually arrived at the outpost where she had been given by her father to the Ericksons. This is the outpost where she had lived as a toddler, playing in the dirt with her African friends, learning the Swahili language. There she visited the graves of her first adoptive parents. Then they drove several miles to the village that her parents had desperately tried to reach, only this time there were hundreds of villagers waiting and cheering as she came into view. They had built arches covered with flowers for her reception. Eventually, the pastor of the church took her up to a hill, to a flat place beneath a grove of trees. This is where her parents' mud hut had once stood. This is where she was born. He then pointed to a simple grave overlooking the valley below. Marking the grave on a small white cross was written, "Svea Flood, 1896 to 1923. Aggie was standing where her mother had once stood, declaring the gospel to one small boy, and now she knew the harvest of the seed her mother had sown. Later in the church, with believing villagers crowding around the pastor, words were read from Psalm 126, verse 5. "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." Some of you are old enough to remember Paul Harvey used to do Stand By for News. And then he'd tell some story like that, and he'd say, "And now you know the rest of the story." Always incredible stories. You know, the story of Joseph is one of those stories. And now I know why the author opened up with the story of Svea and David Flood. You and I can't judge the hand of God before its end is known. When his ways don't make sense, trust him. He's proven. He's trustworthy. You may not understand, but trust. Thank you, Lord. 2 roads out of a city of 2 wells. We'd all like divine deliverance by an army of angels, but sometimes we get sent to slavery and put in prison. Help us to trust even when we don't understand. In Jesus' name, amen. Got about 13 minutes. You're dismissed.